Bavaria, April 1945. The road stretched east from the ruins of Munich, a ribbon of broken asphalt that disappeared into forest shadows thick with the smell of pine and smoke. Marguerite Hoffmann walked alone, her shoes worn through at the heels, her coat stained with mud and something darker. In her arms she carried a bundle wrapped in what had once been a white pillowcase, now gray with dirt and weather. American soldiers at a checkpoint outside Augsburg watched her approach, rifles ready, expecting another refugee with nothing but desperation and lies. But when she reached them and carefully unwrapped what she'd carried for 500 miles, grown men who'd seen the worst of war stepped back in silence. Some wept. One lieutenant would write home that night about the moment his understanding of enemy and ally dissolved completely. The journey had begun in Dresden, or what remained of Dresden. Marguerite stood in the street where her home had been, staring at rubble that still smoked 2 weeks after the bombing. The firestorm had taken everything. Her husband Franz, who'd worked at the rail yards and never joined the party, never raised his arm in salute, never believed the promises. Her parents, who'd lived 3 houses down, her neighbors, her street, her entire world reduced to ash and twisted metal and the smell that made breathing feel like swallowing glass. She was 41 years old. She taught mathematics at the girls' gymnasium before the regime changed the curriculum and decided women should learn childbearing instead of calculus. She'd married Franz in 1928, before the darkness came, when Germany was trying to be something better than its past. They'd had no children. Franz's injury from the Great War had made that impossible, though they'd never spoken of it to anyone else. It was their private sorrow, their shared grief, the ghost that sat at their dinner table every evening. But Marguerite hadn't been entirely childless. The bundle in her arms stirred slightly, and she adjusted her grip, careful despite her exhaustion. Inside the pillowcase, wrapped in layers of cloth to protect against the cold, were 6 leather-bound journals, each one filled with her precise handwriting, covering every page from margin to margin, front and back. Mathematical proofs, theorems, solutions to problems that had occupied the greatest minds in Europe for decades. Work she'd done in secret, by candlelight after Franz fell asleep, because women weren't supposed to understand such things. Work that represented 15 years of her life, hidden from everyone except Franz, who'd encouraged her, even as the world told them both she was wasting her time. The journals were all that remained. Her husband was gone. Her home was gone. Her city was a crater still burning. But the mathematics, that was eternal. That was truth in a world that had forgotten what truth meant. And Marguerite knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with calculation, that if she stayed in the Soviet zone, she would lose even this. The Red Army was coming from the east. Everyone knew it. You could hear the artillery at night, a distant thunder that grew closer each day. The refugees who fled ahead of the advance wrought stories that made Marguerite's hands shake when she tried to sleep. Towns looted, civilians disappeared. Scientists and engineers rounded up and sent east, their knowledge made to serve new masters. The Soviets were taking everything that might be valuable, everyone who might be useful. And Marguerite's journals, filled with advanced mathematical work that touched on ballistics and trajectory calculations and problems with applications in engineering, they would make her very useful indeed. So she wrapped them in a pillowcase, packed what little food she could scavenge from the ruins, filled a canteen with water from a broken pipe, put on her sturdiest shoes and her winter coat, and started walking west, toward American lines that were somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the forests and rivers and bomb-cratered roads, beyond the reach of everything she'd known. That was March 28, 1945. The afternoon was cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Marguerite stood at the edge of what had been her neighborhood and looked back one last time at the rubble that contained everything she'd loved. Then she turned west and walked. The roads were chaos. Rivers of refugees moving in every direction, some fleeing the Soviets, some fleeing the Americans, some just fleeing because staying meant dying. Families pulled carts stacked with possessions. Old men pushed wheelbarrows. Children walked in silence, too exhausted or traumatized to cry. Everyone was starving. Everyone was desperate. The social order that had held Germany together for 1,000 years had collapsed completely, leaving nothing but survival instinct and the thin hope that somewhere ahead things might be better. Marguerite walked through it all, carrying her bundle like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. Not just the journals themselves, but what they represented. Proof that she'd existed. That she'd thought and worked and solved problems that mattered. That she'd been more than what the regime said women should be. The mathematics didn't care about gender or politics or propaganda. Numbers were true, regardless of who calculated them. Proofs were valid, whether written by a man or a woman. The journals were her defiance, her resistance, her quiet revolution wrapped in a pillowcase. She walked 15 miles the first day, her feet blistered by evening, bleeding through her stockings, every step sending pain shooting up her legs. She found shelter in a barn outside a village whose name she never learned, curling up in hay that smelled of horses long since requisitioned by the military. Around her, other refugees settled in for the night. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They were all running from the same things, hoping for the same impossible salvation. That night, Marguerite unwrapped her bundle and checked the journals by the light of a candle someone had lit. The leather covers were still intact, the pages still dry. She ran her fingers over her own handwriting, equations that had taken months to work through, proofs that had required every ounce of concentration she possessed. This was what she was saving. This was what mattered. A woman nearby watched her, eyes suspicious. "What is that?" "Books," Marguerite said simply. "Books?" The woman laughed, bitter and harsh. "My daughter is starving, and you're carrying books?" Marguerite didn't answer. How could she explain? How could she make someone understand that these journals represented 15 years of work, that they contained insights that might matter to someone somewhere, that losing them would mean her entire life had been for nothing? The woman wouldn't understand. Most people wouldn't. But Marguerite wrapped the journals carefully in their pillowcase and held them close as she tried to sleep. The second day brought rain. Cold April rain that soaked through her coat and turned the roads to mud. Marguerite walked through it, one foot in front of the other, her shoes squelching with each step. The bundle stayed dry against her chest, protected by her body and her determination. Other refugees abandoned possessions as they went, leaving trails of furniture and clothing and valuables in the ditches. The road became an archaeological record of what people thought mattered until it became too heavy to carry. But Marguerite kept walking with her journals. 10 miles, 12, 15. Her legs shook with exhaustion. Her feet left bloody footprints in the mud. But she kept moving west, always west, toward American lines that she knew from newspaper reports were somewhere in Bavaria, pushing east toward Munich, closing the gap. She passed through villages that had been abandoned, houses standing empty with doors open and possessions scattered in the streets. She passed burned-out military convoys, the smell of charred metal and death thick in the air. She passed bodies no one had time to bury, lying in ditches or slumped against trees, monuments to a war that was ending in the worst way possible. On the third day, she encountered German soldiers retreating from the front. Young boys and old men, the only ones left after years of casualties. They moved in ragged groups, weapons held loosely, eyes hollow with the understanding that they'd lost everything. Some still wore uniforms. Others had discarded them for civilian clothes, trying to blend in with the refugees, hoping to avoid capture. An officer stopped her. He couldn't have been more than 19, his face pinched with hunger, his uniform too large for his wasted frame. "Where are you going?" West, Marguerite said. The Americans are west. You're walking toward the enemy. Yes. He stared at her, trying to understand. Why? Marguerite adjusted her bundle. Because the Americans won't take what I'm carrying. The officer looked at the pillowcase, puzzled. What is it? Food? Medicine? No. And what? Something that matters, Marguerite said, and kept walking. The officer let her go. He had bigger problems than one middle-aged woman with a bundle. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. The only question was how long the dying would continue before someone admitted the truth. By the fourth day, Marguerite's food was gone. She drank water from streams, knowing it might make her sick, but having no choice. Her stomach cramped with hunger. Her vision swam. But she kept walking, step after painful step, because stopping meant dying, and she hadn't carried these journals 500 miles to die within sight of salvation. She fell in with other refugees, a shifting group that changed composition daily as some dropped out and others joined. There was a family from Berlin, parents with 3 children under 10, an elderly couple who'd fled their farm ahead of Soviet tanks, a young woman traveling alone, her eyes empty, her story unspoken, but written in every gesture. They helped each other when they could, shared what little food anyone had, took turns carrying the children when they couldn't walk anymore. At night they huddled together for warmth, strangers bound by shared desperation. Marguerite told no one what she carried. The journals stayed wrapped in their pillowcase, pressed against her chest, hidden under her coat. On the 7th day, they heard artillery. Not distant thunder anymore, but close, immediate, the earth shaking with each impact. The Americans were near. The refugees picked up their pace, driven by hope and terror in equal measure. If they could reach American lines, they'd be safe, protected, fed, but they had to get there before the shelling caught them, before they became collateral damage in someone else's war. Marguerite pushed forward through pain that had become constant, a white noise of agony in her feet and legs and back. The bundle seemed to grow heavier with each mile, though she knew that was impossible. The journals weighed the same as they always had. It was her strength that was failing, her body consuming itself for energy it didn't have. She thought about Franz, wondered if he'd understand why she was doing this. He'd always supported her work, read her proofs, even though he admitted mathematics beyond basic arithmetic confused him, encouraged her to keep going, even when she wanted to give up. Would he approve of her risking her life for these journals? Or would he beg her to drop them, to save herself? But the journals were all she had left of her life before. Her marriage, her teaching, her secret late-night work. Everything else was ash. If she lost these too, then the firestorm would have taken everything, and Marguerite Hoffman would cease to exist in any meaningful way. She'd be just another refugee, another displaced person, another number in the millions fleeing across Germany in the war's final days. The bundle was her identity, her proof, her defiance. She would carry it to American lines, or she would die trying. On the 10th day, they saw American positions. Soldiers in olive drab uniforms, tanks painted with white stars, artillery pieces pointed east. The checkpoint was outside Augsburg, a roadblock manned by military police who looked young and tired and suspicious of everyone who approached. The refugees slowed, suddenly uncertain. They'd spent years being told Americans were barbaric, cruel, uncivilized. The propaganda had shown images of soldiers who took no prisoners, who destroyed everything they touched, who represented the worst of humanity's capacity for violence. Now they were walking toward these enemies with nothing but hope and prayer. Marguerite kept walking. She'd come 500 miles. She wasn't stopping now. The MPs raised their rifles as the group approached. One of them shouted something in English, probably ordering them to stop. The refugees halted, hands raised, showing they were unarmed. A sergeant stepped forward, his face hard, his weapon ready. He'd processed hundreds of refugees and retreating soldiers. He knew the tricks. the lies, the desperate attempts to avoid capture or secure better treatment. Marguerite walked to the front of the group. Her shoes were held together with strips of cloth. Her coat was caked with mud and blood. Her face was hollow with starvation, her eyes sunken, her lips cracked. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd walked through hell, carrying something she refused to abandon. The sergeant studied her, his expression unreadable. He said something in English. Marguerite didn't understand the words, but recognized the tone, questioning, careful, maybe suspicious. She unwrapped the bundle slowly, making sure her movements were clear and unthreatening. The pillowcase fell away, revealing the 6 leather-bound journals. She held them out, her hands trembling with exhaustion and emotion, and the desperate hope that these men would understand. The sergeant stepped closer, frowning. He opened the top journal, flipped through pages of dense mathematical notation. Equations, proofs, diagrams. His frown deepened. He called to someone behind him, and another soldier approached. This one wore lieutenant's bars and had the look of someone who'd gone to college before the war interrupted his life. The lieutenant took the journal, studied it for a long moment. His expression changed. Surprise, recognition, understanding. He looked at Marguerite, then back at the journal, then at her again. "You wrote this?" he asked in careful German. "Yes, all of them?" "Yes." The lieutenant flipped through more pages, his eyes widening. This is advanced mathematics, differential equations, topological theory. Some of this looks like it touches on ballistics calculations." He looked up at her, reassessing everything. "You're a mathematician?" "I was a teacher. Before. I did this work privately." "For the government?" "No, for myself." The lieutenant studied her face, trying to understand. "You walked here from where?" "Dresden." "Dresden." His voice was soft. Everyone knew what had happened to Dresden. "When?" 2 weeks after. March 28th. The lieutenant calculated quickly. "That's over 500 miles. "Yes." "You walked 500 miles. "Carrying these." "Yes." The lieutenant looked at the journals again, then at Marguerite, and something in his expression shifted. The hardness that came from months of war softened slightly. He called to the sergeant, spoke rapidly in English, gestured at the journals and at Marguerite. The sergeant's expression changed too, surprise and something that might have been respect. "You carried mathematical journals 500 miles across a war zone," the lieutenant said, stating it as fact rather than question, as if saying it aloud would help him believe it. "They're all I have left," Marguerite said simply. "My husband is gone. My home is gone. My city is gone. The journals are proof that I existed, that I thought and worked and solved problems, that I was more than what I was told to be." Her voice cracked slightly. "I couldn't leave them behind." The lieutenant was quiet for a moment. Around them, other soldiers had gathered, curious about what was happening. The other refugees waited at a distance, unsure what this meant for them. "What's your name?" the lieutenant asked. "Marguerite Hoffman. I taught at the girls' gymnasium in Dresden until they changed the curriculum." "Changed it how?" "Women weren't supposed to learn mathematics anymore. We were supposed to learn childbearing instead." Marguerite smiled, bitter and tired. "I taught in secret after that, to any girl who wanted to learn. And I kept working on my own problems at night, because the mathematics didn't care what the regime said women should do. Numbers are true regardless of who calculates them." The lieutenant nodded slowly. He looked at the journals one more time and carefully rewrapped them in the pillowcase. But instead of handing them back to Marguerite, he held them carefully, with the respect you'd give something precious and fragile. "I was a mathematics student at Princeton," he said. "Before the war. I specialized in abstract algebra." He smiled slightly. "I never thought I'd meet a real mathematician at a checkpoint in Bavaria, especially not one who'd walked 500 miles to keep her work safe." "From the Soviets," Marguerite said. They're taking scientists, engineers, anyone with useful knowledge. I didn't want my work taken, used for things I wouldn't choose. So I came west. The lieutenant understood immediately. The Americans knew what the Soviets were doing. Operation WWII. Scientists rounded up and shipped east. Knowledge made to serve new masters. The race was on to secure Germany's intellectual assets before the other side got them. You'll be safe here, the lieutenant said. We'll get you processed, get you food and medical care. And your journals, he held them carefully. I'll make sure they're protected. There are people who'll want to see these. Mathematicians at the universities. People who'll understand what you've accomplished. Marguerite felt something inside her break. Not collapse, but release. The tension that had held her upright for 500 miles suddenly dissolved, and she swayed on her feet. The lieutenant caught her arm, steady and gentle. You're safe now, he said again. You made it. Behind her, the other refugees were being processed through the checkpoint. The family from Berlin. The elderly couple. The young woman with empty eyes. All of them searching for safety in whatever form they could find. But Marguerite had found something more. She'd found someone who understood what she'd carried. Someone who recognized the value of what she'd refused to abandon. The sergeant brought water and a ration pack. Marguerite drank slowly, her hands shaking so badly the canteen rattled against her teeth. The food was chocolate and crackers, and something that might have been cheese. She ate carefully, knowing her stomach couldn't handle too much after days of near starvation. The lieutenant sat beside her while she ate, the journals resting carefully on his lap. Tell me about your work, he said. What problems were you working on? And for the first time in years, Marguerite talked about mathematics with someone who understood. She described the proofs she'd developed, the theorems she'd expanded, the problems she de-solved late at night by candlelight while Franz slept and the world outside grew darker. The lieutenant listened, asked questions, made connections to work being done in America and Britain. They talked for an hour, two mathematics enthusiasts finding common ground in a war zone. Their conversation a small island of normalcy in an ocean of chaos. When they finished, the lieutenant carefully wrapped the journals again and handed them back to Marguerite. Keep them close, he said. I'll arrange for you to be transported to the rear area. There's a displaced persons camp near Munich where you'll be safe while we figure out long-term arrangements. And I'll write a report about what you've done, what you've carried. Make sure the right people know about your work. Thank you, Marguerite said. The words felt inadequate for what she was feeling, but they were all she had. She was processed through the checkpoint with the other refugees, given new documentation that marked her as a displaced person under American protection. A truck took them to a camp where they received medical care and regular meals, and the chance to begin rebuilding whatever lives they could from the wreckage. Marguerite sat in the back of the truck, her bundle pressed against her chest, and watched the road disappear behind them. 500 miles. She walked 500 miles to save 6 journals filled with mathematics that most people would never understand or care about. But she'd done it. She'd refused to abandon what mattered to her, even when everything else was lost. The truck passed through a village where children played in the street, their laughter thin but real. It passed fields where farmers were already planning spring planting, trying to rebuild from the devastation. It passed houses being repaired, lives being reassembled, normalcy being coaxed back into existence. Germany was broken, maybe irreparably. The regime that had promised glory and delivered only death was collapsing into its own ruins. Millions were dead. Cities were destroyed. The nation that had existed for 1,000 years was being divided by conquerors who would reshape it according to their own visions. But Marguerite had saved her journals. She carried them 500 miles across a war zone and delivered them safely to people who understood their value. The mathematics inside represented 15 years of work, 15 years of secret study and late-night calculations and problems solved by a woman who'd been told she shouldn't understand such things. The numbers were true. The proofs were valid. The work was real. And now it would survive, preserved and protected. A testament to one woman's refusal to let everything be taken from her. That night, in the displaced persons camp, Marguerite slept for the first time in weeks without nightmares. The journals lay beside her cot, wrapped in their pillowcase, safe. She'd done what she set out to do. She'd walked 500 miles and saved what mattered most. In the morning, she would begin the work of figuring out what came next, finding out if any of her students had survived, determining whether she could teach again, building some kind of life from the fragments that remained. But for now, she slept. And the journal's proof that Marguerite Hoffman had existed, had thought, had worked, had mattered rested safely beside her, ready to be shared with a world that was slowly, painfully, learning to be better than it had been. The lieutenant kept his promise. He wrote a detailed report about the woman who'd walked 500 miles carrying mathematical journals. The report made its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching academics at American universities who were interested in German scientific talent. Within weeks, Marguerite received an invitation to consult on mathematical problems with applications in engineering and physics. She never returned to Dresden. The city she'd known was gone, replaced by something new being built by Soviet authorities. Her work, her journals, her 15 years of secret study, all of it found a new home in the West, where women could be mathematicians without hiding, where knowledge could be pursued for its own sake, rather than for the regime's purposes. Years later, after she'd emigrated to America and joined the mathematics department at a small college in Pennsylvania, Marguerite would sometimes tell students about the walk. 500 miles across a devastated landscape, carrying everything that mattered wrapped in a pillowcase. They'd ask why she didn't abandon the journals when the going got hard, when her feet bled and her stomach cramped with hunger and death seemed closer than safety. And she'd answer simply, because they were proof. Proof that I existed. Proof that I thought and worked and solved problems. Proof that I was more than what anyone said I should be. The mathematics was truth in a world of lies, and I couldn't leave truth behind. The journals still exist, preserved in a university archive. 6 leather-bound volumes filled with precise handwriting, equations and proofs and solutions to problems that occupied the greatest mathematical minds of the mid-20th century. Work done by candlelight in secret by a woman who refused to accept what the world told her was possible. And sometimes, when students page through those journals, they find small notations in the margins. Dates, location markers, mud stains that survived decades. Physical evidence of the journey those pages made, carried 500 miles through a war zone by a woman who understood that some things matter more than survival itself. Truth matters. Knowledge matters. The work of your mind and hands and heart that matters, even when the world is ending around you. Especially then. Because that's what survives when everything else is lost. That's what rebuilds when the destruction is complete. That's what proves we were here. We thought. We mattered. Marguerite Hoffman carried that truth 500 miles. And it changed everything.